The sun had barely set over Earth's eastern coastline when the alert came through. An unidentified vessel, a massive ship, was emerging from the deepest reaches of space. For hours, it had been evading detection, slipping past humanity's most advanced sensors without a trace. The military scrambled into action, but the arrival of this ship was not the first time humanity had been forced to respond to an alien presence. What made this different was the insignia on the hull, a symbol that hadn't been seen in decades, the mark of the Zharan Empire. The Zharans had been Earth's enemies for years, their empire a cruel, expansionist power that had launched wave after wave of invasions against humanity. But the last fleet, the one that had fought in the Great Battle of Europa, had been wiped out. No one had heard from them since, that is, until now. Inside the United Earth Defense Command, UEDC, Admiral Marlowe ran a hand through his hair as he studied the data on the holographic map. "This is no mistake," he said, his voice cold. "The Zharans are back, or what's left of them." Alara Drake, captain of Earth's most advanced battleship, the Sentinel, stood by his side, her mind racing. She had been through hell with the Zharans before, but now the thought of them returning was unimaginable. "Do we know why they're here?" she asked, her voice sharp and steady. "Not yet," Marlowe replied, "but their ship is heading straight for Earth. No signs of aggression, yet. Still, we can't afford to wait. We need to make contact." "Understood," Alara said, stepping back and tapping into her comms. "Prepare the Sentinel for immediate departure. We'll head out to intercept." Her mind raced as the orders were carried out. She knew this wasn't just any ordinary Zharan ship. There was something about the way it appeared that felt off, almost as if they were waiting for someone waiting for her. As the Sentinel took off from the launch bay, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Zharans had been a relentless enemy, merciless and unforgiving. What could possibly cause them to return after so long, and why now? What could they want from Earth? Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice over the comms. "Captain Drake, we're receiving a transmission from the Zharan vessel. They're requesting to speak with you." Alara's stomach tightened. "Patch it through," she ordered, standing tall at the helm of her ship. The holographic display flickered before a figure appeared in front of her, an alien woman with the sharp features of the Zharan, her face gaunt and pale, eyes cold, but with a hint of urgency. "Captain Drake, we come in peace," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, almost resigned. "We need your help." Alara's hands clenched into fists, but she kept her voice steady. "Help? After everything your people have done to us?" "We are not the ones you fought," the Zharan woman replied. "We are not here as your enemies. We are fugitives, and we are running out of time." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Alara's mind raced. She wasn't a fool. This could be a trap, a desperate ploy to get humanity's defenses off guard. But she also knew that if they were truly fleeing, then something far greater was at stake. The question was, would she risk everything to find out? "What do you want from us?" Alara demanded, her voice unwavering. "We possess something that can end the Sindrath, but we need protection." "Your protection," the woman said, her eyes never leaving Alara's. "And your help. Time is running out. The Sindrath are coming." The name sent a chill down Alara's spine. The Sindrath, a race of ruthless conquerors, far more dangerous than the Zharans ever were. Earth had barely survived their first invasion. "Why should we trust you?" Alara asked, her gaze hard. "Because you have no choice," the Zharan woman replied, her tone now sharp. "The Sindrath are coming, and if you don't protect us, Earth will fall, and the galaxy will burn." Alara took a slow breath, her eyes narrowing. The stakes were higher than she could have imagined. The Zharans had always been a formidable enemy, but if they were telling the truth, this was bigger than anything she had ever faced. "Tell me what you're offering," Alara said, her mind already calculating the risks. "But know this, if this is a trap, we will destroy you." The Zharan woman nodded grimly. "We are not your enemy, Captain, but the one who follows us might be." With that, the transmission ended, leaving Alara standing in silence, the weight of her next decision pressing down on her shoulders. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to call for reinforcements, but her experience told her that sometimes the most dangerous choices were the ones that led to the biggest revelations. Alara's heart hammered in her chest as the Sentinel glided toward the Jaren vessel. The sight of it was imposing, its sleek, battle-worn hull reflecting the faint light of distant stars. It looked like a ghost, a remnant of an empire that had once held the galaxy in a vice of fear. Yet here it was, alive and defiant. The Jaren vessel's comms crackled. "Captain Drake, we have been cleared for docking. Prepare for transfer." Alara barely had time to absorb the words before the ship's hull groaned with the sound of docking clamps locking into place. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her mind was anything but. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. The Sindrath were coming, and the artifact, whatever it was, held the key to humanity's survival. But trusting the Jarens, even these rogue rebels, felt like betting everything on a single roll of the dice. "All hands, brace for potential contact," Alara ordered, her voice calm, but tinged with the weight of the unknown. "Prepare to board." As the airlock opened and Alara and her team stepped onto the Jaren vessel, the sight before them was unlike anything she had ever expected. The inside of the ship was dim, almost sterile, with walls lined with advanced technology. The Jaren rebels, once proud warriors, now appeared desperate, ragged and thin, eyes haunted by something far worse than just war. The leader of the rebels, a grizzled Jaren named Varric, met Alara at the docking bay. His pale, angular face was set in a grimace, eyes scanning her with a mixture of caution and respect. "You came," Varric said, his voice rough but filled with a deep urgency. "I knew you would. It's not about trust anymore, Captain. It's about survival." Alara nodded curtly. "Where's the artifact? I need to see it." Varric hesitated for just a moment before nodding, leading her through a series of narrow hallways. They passed other rebels who stared at Alara with suspicion, but there was no hostility, only a palpable fear that made her skin crawl. When they reached the chamber, Alara stopped cold. There it was, in the center of the room, a strange, oblong device suspended in midair by a web of pulsing energy. Its surface shimmered, constantly shifting like liquid metal, but it was the eyes, glowing faintly within the core, that unsettled her the most. "This is Core," Varric said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A weapon, a tool, a prisoner, and now it's our only hope." Alara's gaze narrowed. Core was something else, something ancient, something beyond her understanding. But the power it radiated was undeniable, and for a moment, she felt her heart skip as if the artifact itself was testing her, reaching out to make contact. "It's alive, isn't it?" Alara asked, her voice barely audible. Varric's eyes met hers. "Yes, it's more than alive, and it's more than just a weapon. Core is a consciousness, a being trapped inside this device for millennia. The Sindrath have used it to control and conquer entire civilizations. They believe if they can take it back, their empire will be unstoppable." Alara stepped closer, her breath hitching as she reached out to touch the device. The moment her fingers brushed against its surface, an electric jolt shot through her arm, her entire body locking in place. Her mind flooded with visions, snapshots of ancient worlds burning, the Sindrath marching across them, their twisted, monstrous forms reveling in destruction. But amidst the chaos, a single figure stood tall, a being with the same glowing eyes as the artifact, commanding destruction with a calm, cold determination. Then the vision snapped away, leaving Alara gasping for breath, her heart racing. She staggered back, the reality of what she had just witnessed weighing heavily on her mind. "It's more than just a weapon," she whispered, her voice shaky. "It's part of them. The Sindrath." Varric nodded grimly. "Yes, and we need your help to stop them." Ilara's eyes darted from Varric to Kor. The artifact had just shown her something that no one could have prepared her for. A piece of history, a deep connection between the Gerens, the Sindrath, and Kor itself. It was too dangerous to leave in the wrong hands. But the question remained, who could they trust now? Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the ship. A red light flashed on the overhead panels, and a voice crackled through the comms. "Sindrath forces have been detected in the sector." Ilara's pulse quickened. They were already here. "Prepare for battle," Ilara ordered. "This is no longer just about the artifact. We fight to survive." As the rebels scrambled to defend the ship, Ilara stared at Kor. Now more than just a weapon, now more than just an artifact, it was a ticking bomb. The Sindrath were coming, and with them, they carried death. And if Ilara didn't act quickly, the galaxy would burn. The alarms were deafening as the Zeren vessel rocked violently, its hull shuddering under the weight of incoming fire from Sindrath ships. Ilara's mind raced, her thoughts flicking between the urgent need to defend the ship and the growing unease that gnawed at her. The Sindrath had arrived faster than expected, but something about this felt too coordinated. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just reacting to the artifact's presence. They knew something she didn't. "Captain, we've got multiple Sindrath ships inbound," the tactical officer on the Sentinel reported over comms. "They're deploying boarding pods." Ilara's grip tightened on the console as the transmission crackled with static. "Alert all personnel. Prepare for combat," she barked, rushing toward the Geren's command center. Inside, the rebel crew was scrambling. Varric was barking orders, his face a mask of determination, but there was something different about him, something that didn't sit right with Ilara. "What's the status on Kor?" Ilara demanded, locking eyes with Varric. "The artifact is secure for now," Varric said, his voice tense, but he avoided her gaze. "We're ready to fight, Captain." But as Ilara studied his expression, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, something that didn't belong. She trusted him less now than she had when they first met. A sudden explosion shook the ship, and the lights flickered. Ilara stumbled but caught herself against a console. The battle outside had escalated, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something more insidious was happening within. "Stay alert," she muttered under her breath, her instincts screaming that the danger wasn't just on the battlefield. Minutes later, the door to the command center slammed open. A lone Geren soldier, disheveled and panicked, rushed in, his eyes wide with terror. "Varric, it's happening. They've taken Kor." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes darted to Varric, who had gone pale at the news. Before she could react, the soldier continued, his voice trembling. "They're trying to activate it. It's a trap. Varric sold us out." The soldier's breath came in ragged gasps. "We didn't know, Captain. He's been working with the Sindrath the whole time. Kor was always their weapon." Ilara's blood ran cold as the revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known something was off, but she hadn't expected this. The artifact wasn't just a weapon. It was the key to unleashing a new age of destruction. One that the Sindrath had been planning for all along. "Varric," Ilara snapped, her voice icy as she turned to face him. "Is this true?" Varric's eyes shifted, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he signaled for his guards to move in. Two Geren soldiers, previously stationed by the door, stepped forward, weapons drawn. "Ilara, you have no idea what you're dealing with," Varric said, his voice low, dark with regret and cold determination. "Kor isn't just some artifact. It's the Sindrath's true power. I did what I had to do. I did it for survival, for the future of the galaxy. We've been pawns in their game for centuries. With Kor in our hands, we could control everything." Ilara's mind whirled. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The Geren who had fought beside her, the one who had sworn to protect humanity, had been a traitor all along. He had used them all, led them into a battle he knew they couldn't win, just to secure core for himself and his Sindrath allies. "You're insane," Alara spat, taking a step toward him. "You betrayed us. You betrayed everything we fought for." Varric's eyes were hard as stone. "It's not betrayal, Captain. It's the only way. The Sindrath will give us power beyond anything you can imagine. Core will ensure we rule together." Before Alara could respond, a deafening explosion erupted from the lower levels of the ship. The walls trembled as more Sindrath forces boarded, their deadly presence felt in every corner of the vessel. The soldiers accompanying Varric seized the opportunity, raising their weapons and taking aim. Ilara's pulse quickened. Her mind raced as she calculated her next move. She was surrounded, but she couldn't let Varric escape with Core. Not now. Not when everything depended on stopping the Sindrath from using the artifact to destroy humanity. With a swift motion, Alara drew her sidearm, firing at one of Varric's soldiers. The rebel dropped to the floor, incapacitated but alive. The other soldiers hesitated, giving Alara the opening she needed. "Secure Core," Alara ordered, her voice sharp. "We need to get to the artifact before he activates it." In the chaos, she grabbed the traitor by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You won't get away with this." But as she stared into Varric's eyes, she saw something disturbing, a glimmer of doubt, perhaps even regret. But it was too late for redemption now. The Sindrath were coming, and Varric's betrayal had set everything in motion. Humanity's future hung in the balance, and there was no turning back. The war for the galaxy had begun, and Alara Drake was its unwilling champion. The tension in the command center was suffocating. Varric struggled against Alara's grip, his eyes wild with desperation. He was no longer the leader of the rebels that Alara had once trusted. He was a man driven by something darker, something more dangerous. His betrayal had already cost them precious time, and now, with Sindrath forces swarming the ship, every moment was critical. Alara slammed Varric into the wall one more time, making him wince. "Where is Core?" she demanded, her voice low and menacing. "Tell me now, Varric. You don't want me to start asking questions." Varric's eyes were filled with fury, but there was a flicker of something else, a momentary hesitation. "You don't understand," he snarled. "You think you can just stop this? You're playing into their hands. The Sindrath are unstoppable. With Core at their side, they'll crush Earth, and every rebel you've ever fought for will die in vain." Alara's pulse thudded in her ears, but she didn't flinch. "I'll stop them, even if it means killing you." Before Varric could respond, a loud explosion shook the ship again, followed by the deafening roar of Sindrath soldiers breaching the main corridors. The blast sent everyone in the command center sprawling to the ground, and the lights flickered ominously. Alara didn't waste a second. She pushed Varric away, grabbing her sidearm and charging toward the door. "We don't have time for this," Alara muttered under her breath, taking command in the chaos. "Move out now." Her team snapped into action, weapons drawn and ready. They stormed out into the hallway, encountering the first wave of Sindrath soldiers. Their grotesque forms towered over the rebels, armored in black and violet plating, their weapons glowing with dangerous energy. The hallway filled with the staccato sounds of gunfire as Alara and her crew engaged the Sindrath. Despite the chaos, Alara's focus never wavered. The Sindrath had no idea what they were dealing with. Her eyes burned with a singular purpose. She had to reach Core before they did. As the battle raged around her, Alara's mind flicked back to Varric's words. He had said that Core was their only hope of controlling the galaxy. But what if the truth was even worse than he realized? What if Core was not a weapon humanity could wield, but something more dangerous, a force of destruction too powerful for any of them to control? "Captain," shouted Lieutenant Callan, one of Alara's most trusted officers. He was crouched behind a nearby bulkhead, firing at a Sindrath soldier attempting to flank them. "We've got a problem. Core is being moved. It's on the move, headed toward the lower decks." Alara's stomach churned. Varric's betrayal had been calculated, a move to get to the artifact before they could destroy it. They had to stop it, or rather, stop him from activating it. "Take point," she ordered, voice tight. "Move to the lower decks now." The team sprinted down the corridor, and as they rounded the corner toward the elevator shaft leading to the lower decks, Alara's worst fear was confirmed. Varric was there, along with a small contingent of Jaren rebels, guarding the path to the artifact. He was holding a small device in his hand, an activation switch for Core, and his eyes met hers with a cold, determined expression. "You've lost, Captain," Varric said, his voice booming over the noise of battle. "There's no escaping this. The Sindrath will rise, and you will kneel before them." Alara's blood ran cold. She took a step forward, drawing her weapon. "You don't get to decide that, Varric." Varric's lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you can stop me? You've already lost. There's no turning back now." Before Alara could fire, a sudden explosion detonated in the hallway behind them, sending her crashing into the wall. The shockwave knocked the breath from her lungs, and the world spun as she struggled to regain her footing. A few meters away, the Jaren rebels were scattering in panic as another squad of Sindrath soldiers advanced, their heavy weapons leveling everything in their path. "We don't have time," Callan shouted, his voice urgent as he helped Alara back to her feet. "The Sindrath are coming. Core is almost activated." Alara's eyes darted to the device in Varric's hand. He was moments away from triggering the artifact. Desperation surged through her as she bolted forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to stop him before he unleashed Core, before the Sindrath got what they came for. With a roar, Alara fired, her shot ringing out in the chaos. The bullet struck Varric's arm, knocking the activation device from his hand. He screamed in pain, his eyes flashing with rage as he dove to recover it. But before he could reach it, Alara was there, her foot stomping on his hand, crushing it beneath her boot. "Game over," she hissed, grabbing the device and ripping it from his grasp. But just as she thought she had won, a sudden blinding flash of light filled the corridor, and the unmistakable sound of Core's power began to hum. It was activating, its energy pulsing in waves of devastating force. Alara's heart sank. Varric hadn't triggered it, not yet, but the Sindrath were closing in, and Core was on the verge of becoming unstoppable. The countdown had already begun. The hum of Core's power vibrated through the walls, a deep bone-shaking pulse that sent a wave of dread surging through Alara's chest. She could feel it in the air, the subtle shift as the artifact began to awaken, its ancient energy stirring, ready to flood the ship with its devastating force. There was no more time to waste. If Core fully activated, the Sindrath would have the power to obliterate humanity, to crush everything the rebels had fought for. "Move," Alara shouted, pushing Varric aside and sprinting toward the control panel that would deactivate the artifact. But the Sindrath were too close. She could hear their heavy footsteps reverberating down the hall, their low, guttural growls as they advanced toward her. Callan and the others took cover behind what little debris they could find, returning fire to slow the Sindrath's advance. But it wasn't enough. Their weapons could barely penetrate the Sindrath's armor, and Alara knew that each moment they delayed brought them closer to the brink of total destruction. "Captain," Callan's voice was strained, "you need to stop Core. It's too strong. We won't make it if it's activated." Alara's mind raced, calculating the odds. She had to reach the artifact's core to manually shut it down before the Sindrath could take control. But she was too far from the device. The closer she got, the more Core's power seemed to thrash against her like an animal clawing to be freed. Every step felt like she was walking through water, the weight of its energy pressing down on her chest. Varric was still on the floor, clutching his arm, the blood from his wound staining his clothes. His face was twisted in pain, but his eyes were hard, fierce with the conviction that he had done the right thing. "You can't stop it," he muttered between gasps. No one can. Kor belongs to the Sindrath. It always has. Alara's eyes narrowed as she looked down at him, her heart pounding with anger. You've signed humanity's death warrant. You let them manipulate you. But Varric wasn't finished. His lips curled into a sneer as he pushed himself to his knees. It's not about them anymore, Captain. It's about what's coming after them. Kor is the key to survival. You can't comprehend its power. As his words echoed through the chamber, the walls trembled again, the hum of Kor growing louder, more insistent. The Sindrath had finally made it to the door. Alara's eyes flicked between Varric and the artifact. There was no more time for arguments. No more time to understand what Kor truly was, or what Varric believed it could accomplish. She had one chance, and she had to take it. With a roar, she sprinted toward the artifact's core. The air crackled with energy, and a burning heat emanated from the device as if it were alive. As Alara reached the control panel, her hand hesitated for only a moment. She had no idea what would happen if she tried to stop it, if it would destroy the entire ship or, worse, release its power in a way that no one could control. But she had no other choice. Fingers trembling, she slammed her hand onto the control panel. Sparks flew, and the ship groaned as the power systems were forced into overdrive. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a sudden burst of light flooded the room, and the walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with the artifact's energy. "Stop it!" Varric screamed, dragging himself toward her. "You have no idea what you're doing." But Alara didn't flinch. She was too focused. Kor was fighting her, trying to reject her interference, its power growing exponentially. The entire ship seemed to warp around her, as if the artifact's energy was bending reality itself. The ground shook beneath her feet, and her ears rang with the roar of untold power. Then, with a violent shockwave, the light exploded from the core, sending Alara sprawling backward. She crashed against the floor, her vision blurring. The ship lurched, and for a moment, Alara thought they were all doomed. But then, something changed. The light from Kor dimmed, and the hum of its energy began to fade. The room, though still shaking, lost its oppressive weight. Alara pushed herself to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were shaking, but she knew one thing for certain. She had done it. She had stopped Kor from fully activating, but the damage was far from over. The door to the control room exploded open, and the Sindrath forces stormed inside. Alara barely had time to raise her weapon before the first soldier tackled her to the ground, pinning her beneath its massive frame. The air was thick with the sound of clashing weapons, but Alara barely noticed. She had done what she set out to do. She had stopped the artifact from falling into their hands. Yet, as the Sindrath dragged her to her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and humanity's greatest challenge had only just begun. Alara's vision swam as she was hauled to her feet, her arms bound tightly by the Sindrath soldiers. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt metal and the stench of smoke from the battle raging throughout the ship. She could hear her crew fighting, their desperate shouts and the roar of blaster fire reverberating down the corridors. But she didn't have the luxury of turning to them for help. She had failed. Kor was still partially activated, its power lingering, but the true devastation of the Sindrath's weapon hadn't been unleashed yet. She was now a prisoner, captured by the very forces she had fought so hard to stop. The Sindrath commander, a towering figure draped in black and violet armor, approached her. His presence was suffocating, his body language exuding dominance and cold calculation. He studied her with an almost detached interest as he loomed over her. "You're a resilient one," the commander said, his voice a low growl. "But resistance is futile. The Sindrath will rise. You and your pathetic rebellion will be nothing but a memory." Alara's teeth ground together in silent fury. Despite the pain in her body, despite the overwhelming sense of defeat creeping in, she refused to let them see her break. The Syndrath might win the battle, she spat, blood dribbling from her mouth, but humanity will fight until the very end. The commander's lips curled into a smirk, a noble sentiment. Too bad you won't live to see it. With a swift motion, he signaled to his soldiers. One of them pressed a button on a nearby console, and the door slid open. Elara's heart skipped as she saw Varric, shackled and bruised, being dragged in by 2 Syndrath soldiers. His eyes met hers, a look of guilt and desperation flashing across his face. "Varric," she shouted, her voice raw. "What have you done?" Varric's expression faltered for a moment, then hardened. His gaze dropped to the ground, as if he couldn't meet her eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But I was wrong. The Syndrath, they're not what I thought they were." Elara's stomach twisted. This was the man she had trusted, the man who had led the charge to protect humanity. But in the end, his ambition had clouded his judgment, and now they were both at the mercy of the Syndrath. The commander chuckled, walking toward Varric. "The traitor speaks. Too late for redemption." He turned back to Elara. "The artifact will soon be fully activated. Once that happens, there is no stopping the Syndrath. Your people will cower, and your pathetic resistance will collapse under the weight of our power." Varric's head snapped up, his eyes wide with realization. "No, Kor, it isn't just a weapon. Silence," the commander snapped, backhanding him with brutal force. Varric crumpled to the floor, blood trickling from his lip. Elara's heart twisted at the sight of him, her former comrade reduced to this broken shell of a man. She couldn't understand what had driven him to betray everything they had fought for, but she knew one thing for sure. If they were going to survive this, if humanity had any chance of making it out of this alive, she couldn't allow the Syndrath to control Kor. With all her strength, Elara forced her gaze back to the commander. "You may have won this round," she said, her voice cold, "but you won't win the war. Humanity will always fight back." The commander's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint in them. "You are mistaken. Kor is more than just a weapon. It is a harbinger of the new order. The Syndrath will rule, and all others will bend the knee or be crushed." Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the ship, sending everyone to the floor. Elara's head snapped back as the room trembled violently. The alarms blared, and the lights flickered, plunging the command center into near darkness. "We're under attack," one of the Syndrath soldiers shouted, his voice filled with panic. The commander scowled, his gaze flicking to the monitors showing flashing red lights and the approach of more enemy ships. "What is this?" Elara's mind raced. The attack had come from her forces, but it wasn't a typical assault. It was a diversion, a final, desperate push to reclaim control. Her crew had found a way to exploit the Syndrath's weakness, their overconfidence, their belief that victory was already assured. "This is it," Elara muttered to herself, a spark of hope reigniting in her chest. Her eyes locked on Varric, who was still struggling to regain his bearings. "Varric," she whispered urgently, "we can still stop this. Help me." He looked up at her, a mix of fear and resolve on his face. His fingers twitched against his shackles as he glanced at the control panel near the artifact. Elara knew what she had to do. If she could get to the artifact's core, if she could shut it down before the Syndrath activated its full power, there was a chance, a small, desperate chance, that they could turn the tide of the war. Varric's eyes met hers one last time. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, filled with regret, "but it's not too late." With a surge of energy, Elara wrenched herself free from the guards who were holding her and dashed toward the control panel, her pulse racing. The countdown was almost over, but as she reached for the controls, she knew this final stand would come with a cost. But she would never give up. Not as long as humanity still had a chance to fight back. Elara's heart hammered in her chest as she sprinted toward the artifact's control panel, her mind focused solely on one thing: stopping the Syndrath. The ship was crumbling around her, the violent tremors of battle shaking the walls as enemy forces continued their assault. The countdown to full activation of Core was almost complete. It was now or never. She reached the panel, her hands trembling from exhaustion and the weight of the situation. With a flick of her wrist, she sent sparks flying as she forced the system open, revealing a complex array of wires, codes, and glowing symbols, an alien language that she barely understood. But she didn't need to. She'd learned enough during her years as a rebel leader to know how to disable most things, even if it meant brute force. Ilara. Varric's voice rang out behind her, a desperate shout from across the room. You can't. Shut up, Varric, she snapped, not turning around. This is it. If we don't do this now, we're all dead. He had no reply, and for a moment, Ilara allowed herself to feel the weight of the decisions she'd made, the friends lost, the battles fought, and the betrayal of a once loyal comrade. But there was no time for regret. Humanity had one final chance. With a steadying breath, Ilara plunged her hand into the guts of the control panel, ripping out wires and tearing through layers of alien tech. A jolt of energy shot through her body, sending her crashing against the wall. Pain lanced through her skull, but Ilara refused to give in. She pushed herself back to her feet, a growl escaping her lips as she fought through the dizziness. The countdown on the holographic screen before her continued its relentless march forward. 10 seconds. 9, 8. In that moment, everything felt as if it were moving in slow motion. Her thoughts were sharp, but the pressure around her was crushing. She could feel the presence of the Sindrath soldiers drawing closer, their footsteps deafening as they stormed the room. Yet none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was Core. It had to be stopped. Another explosion rocked the ship, sending the lights into a flurry of flickering chaos. The room was plunged into near darkness, save for the eerie glow of Core's activation matrix. Ilara's fingers fumbled for the final wire, the last piece of the puzzle she needed to sever. Her vision swam in and out, the room spinning, her limbs heavy from the toll of battle and the constant pain. She found the wire. It was a bright crimson strand, the energy pulsing through it like a heartbeat. Her hand wrapped around it. This is it. Just as she began to pull the wire free, a voice, cold and dripping with malice, echoed in the room. Do you truly believe you can stop this, Captain? Ilara's breath hitched, and she whipped around to face the voice. The Sindrath commander stood at the door, flanked by his elite soldiers, his posture calm and unshaken by the chaos around him. He watched her with a smug, almost amused expression. You're too late, the commander continued, his voice low. The artifact is already part of us. Even if you deactivate it, it will only be a matter of time before we regain control. Ilara felt the knot of despair tighten in her stomach, but she didn't stop. You're wrong, she spat, her hands already moving to finish the task. You underestimate humanity. We're not like you. The commander stepped closer, his dark eyes narrowing. You don't understand. Core is beyond your comprehension. The Sindrath will use it to reshape this galaxy. You will be nothing but dust. Ilara's pulse raced. She had no time for his words, no time for his delusions. Core was not a weapon for any one species to control. It was a force, a power, and it would destroy all of them if it fell into the wrong hands. With one final tug, Ilara yanked the crimson wire from the panel, sending a shockwave through the room. The screen flickered, the countdown halted, and the humming energy of Core began to wane. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the ship held its breath. Then all hell broke loose. The ship's systems screeched in protest as a massive explosion erupted from deep within the ship. The room shook violently, the walls cracking and groaning under the strain. Ilara was thrown backward, her vision blurring as the shockwave hit. The Sindrath commander was thrown to the ground, his soldiers flailing in the chaos. The lights flickered one final time, and then everything plunged into darkness. Ilara's body was heavy with the weight of her injuries as she slowly pushed herself to her feet, struggling to maintain her balance. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning debris. Her hands were covered in blood, her vision blurred, but she could still hear the faint, distant sounds of battle echoing through the ship. The rebels were fighting, holding their ground, and somehow they had a chance. But Kor was not fully gone. Ilara knew that. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The Sindrath would not stop. Not now, not ever. But in that moment of darkness, with everything shaking and the battle still raging, Ilara realized something. Humanity wasn't done yet. They had survived the worst. They were broken, battered, but still standing. And as long as they still stood, they would fight. The darkness pressed in around Ilara like a suffocating blanket, but even in the midst of the chaos, she could still hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow but deliberate, across the shattered hall. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought to shake off the dizziness, the throb of pain from every inch of her battered body. She pushed herself up, ignoring the blood dripping from her brow, the burn in her muscles. The fight wasn't over. She glanced around at the remnants of the control room, burned-out consoles, twisted metal, and the occasional spark from exposed wiring. The flickering lights cast strange shadows on the walls, but it was the silence that gripped her, the eerie calm that followed the explosion. It's too quiet. Then she heard it, the unmistakable growl of a Sindrath soldier. The fight wasn't over. The Sindrath were still here, still pressing toward victory. The momentary setback, the explosion, had only bought them a few precious minutes. But Ilara knew the truth. The Sindrath would not stop. Not now, not ever, not as long as Kor existed. She staggered forward, her boots crunching over the debris, toward the still-functioning portion of the ship's systems. There was a pulse of energy emanating from the direction of Kor's core, a sickening hum that pulsed with power, trying to find its way back to full activation. She had to finish this. She had to find a way to destroy Kor for good, to make sure it didn't fall into the Sindrath's hands. Ilara's hand shook as she reached for the comms device on her belt. She activated it, her voice hoarse and ragged. "Captain Callan, report. Where are you?" There was a crackle of static before Callan's voice came through, muffled but still audible. "We're holding them back, Captain. But they're regrouping. They're on their way to the Central Command. If Kor isn't stopped now, it will tear through the entire fleet. We're running out of time." Ilara closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the weight of the situation to press down on her. The whole fleet, her crew, her people, everything they had fought for, was hanging by a thread. And in that moment, she realized something terrifying. Even if she stopped Kor here, the Sindrath would still be a force in the galaxy. They'd never let this go. There would always be another war. But humanity, despite everything, would fight. It was what they did. They had never been afraid of impossible odds. "I'm going to finish this," she said through gritted teeth. "Keep fighting, Captain. Hold them off for just a little longer." She terminated the comms and turned back to the control panel. She needed to break Kor's link to the ship's systems, to shut it down completely. But as she approached the control matrix, something shifted in the room, an overwhelming pressure, as if the very air had become thicker. It felt wrong, unnatural. A low, guttural voice broke through the tension. "You cannot stop us, Captain." Ilara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The Sindrath commander stood there, his imposing figure silhouetted against the wreckage, the remnants of the ship's light casting an eerie glow over his face. His eyes were filled with venom, but there was something more behind them now, something that made Ilara's blood run cold. "You failed," he said, his voice low and mocking. "The artifact cannot be destroyed. It is part of us now, a symbol of our strength. You were too weak to see it." Ilara's fingers hovered over the deactivated control panel, her heart thundering in her chest. She had to end this now. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for humanity's future. "You're wrong," Ilara said, her voice steady, though her body trembled with the strain. "You may have the power of core, but you'll never have our will. Humanity will never bow to you." The Sindrath commander laughed, his deep, chilling laugh reverberating in the air. "You think you've won? This is only the beginning, human. The galaxy will be ours." But Ilara knew better. She didn't need to destroy core, she just needed to sever the Sindrath's hold on it, destroy the last vestige of their power. She learned everything she needed to know from the rebel texts, from the ancient texts hidden in the archives. Core was a conduit, but it could be turned off. With one final, desperate push, she slammed her hand against the control panel. The lights flickered again, and the room seemed to vibrate with an intense, low hum. Then, with a violent surge, the ship's entire system powered down in an instant. The artifact let out a final deafening scream, an unnatural cry that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the ship, and then silence. Ilara collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily, her body spent. She could feel the weight of the victory settling in, but there was no time for celebration. The Sindrath commander let out a strangled cry of fury, rushing toward her. But he never reached her. Callan's voice crackled through the comms urgent. "Captain, we're securing the ship. It's over. The artifact is down." Ilara's heart skipped a beat as the adrenaline coursed through her. It wasn't over. There was still so much left to do, so much left to fight for. But she knew one thing for certain. Humanity had won. As the dust began to settle, and the faint light of dawn crept through the shattered windows, Ilara stood, battered but unbroken. She had led humanity through the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. But the war was far from over. This was only the beginning, and humanity would be ready.